I'll start, I suppose, with a nod to Waterford, because Waterford is mentioned throughout this report. A report that, may I say, is an excellent piece of work and should be an important piece of work if it's implemented. I would hope that it becomes an important piece of work. But Waterford is rightly mentioned. It has led the way on the repair and lease scheme, and most of that has turned up in our urban centres, exactly where it's needed in terms of bringing people into the heart of the town. But I would also say that Waterford has led the way in terms of high quality public realm, has invested heavily in public realm in Waterford City, in Dungarvan Town Centre, in Tramore Town Centre. And I would also give a nod to the Integrated Homelessness Service on Parnell Street in Waterford, which has helped mitigate at least some of the issues around homelessness that are being experienced across the country. And I would agree with what Deputy Ledden said about there being a false dichotomy here between urban and rural, and Waterford provides us with a microcosm of, I suppose, the whole country. We have Ireland's oldest urban centre in Waterford City, but we also have settlements such as Tramore and Dungarvan, which are greater than 10,000, so mid-sized towns, and then smaller communities like Cappoquin, Lismore, Ballymacarbery. But all of these urban centres, all of them, stand to be improved and to benefit from serious investment and a serious tackling of vacancy and dereliction. And here, like, I'll probably be slightly partisan, but I'll be forgiven. And notwithstanding the presence of yourself and Deputy O'Brien, well, we see the Green Party overrepresented in the chamber this evening, and there is a sense that the Green Party maybe is talking to itself a little bit here. But funnily enough, this is actually what it sounds like. But this is what it sounds like when the Green Party talks amongst themselves, because we bring a different lens to issues of this kind. And I think we've made a significant contribution in this government in reimagining how we approach the issue of housing, because we take, I suppose, an ecological approach or a systems-based approach where we see these things as they knit themselves together. And I hope that we're bringing an element of policy coherence when we discuss housing. It's not just housing alone, but it's the Town Centres First policy. It's the Our Rural Future policy. It's Connecting Ireland, where we begin to bring public transport between those communities. It's the active travel funding that helps people move around those urban centres, and all those things knit together. Because homes are a physical expression of our social fabric, and they're a relatively permanent expression of that. Decisions that we make in our built environment have consequences, and very long-lasting consequences. And in the last few decades, we've allowed ourselves to become atomised, and I have to wonder if that's an expression of the economic system and the extreme individualism that we see in neo-capitalism. Because, as Deputy McAuliffe referred to earlier, not all housing is created equal. Dispersed housing patterns, that results in fragmented communities, that locks in transport emissions, and it's very interesting to me that there's actually a specific chapter in this report on transport-oriented development, very progressive. Dispersed housing patterns undermines local services like public transport, like the face-to-face interaction that Deputy Batchich mentioned, the local shop, the local school, the local pub. And it makes services like utilities, wastewater, local road infrastructure so much more challenging to provide for. And it pressurises our land use patterns. It makes it difficult for us to look at things like forestry, in terms of agriculture, in terms of renewables, makes all of those decisions so much more difficult to implement. And then the opposite is also true. If we look at good quality urban regeneration, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to knit communities together. It's going to sustain the local shop, the local school, the local pub. All of those things are going to come in, and it's going to make it hugely easier for a government to provide things like high quality public services, high quality public transport, for example. And I think additional to that, addressing vacancy and dereliction can address all of these issues, but also takes account in a meaningful way of embodied energy and the embodied carbon, and indeed the embodied heritage skills and the heritage materials that are often built into these properties. And Deputy Duffy referred to that, and I know the Minister is very strong on the idea of heritage skills being used to regenerate our vacant and derelict properties. Deputy O'Brien referenced the idea of both stick and carrot, and I do broadly agree with that in terms of taxation. We'd be at variance, Deputy, in our approach to local property tax, and I know that you're dead set against it. I would have a concern that, well, if we're not taxing property, we don't do a good job in this country of taxing wealth. And if we leave property out of that equation, it leaves a huge lacuna. But I'm not convinced that the local property tax as currently constituted does all of the jobs that we need it to do. Now, the taxes that are proposed in this, the derelict site tax and the vacant property tax, these are perhaps supplemental, but I'm not sure it's the direction that we should actually be going. We've long been arguing for a site valuation tax or site value tax, which I think could be a much more complete and a much more powerful tool in terms of both taxing wealth, but also for activating sites and properties in our urban centres. And I think a site valuation tax acknowledges that proportion of a site's value that actually derives from the state's investment in the services that surround that property. And it's definitely a direction in which I think we'd like to go. I think every one of us here is looking for the same thing. We're looking for thriving cities and towns, sustainable in terms of population, sustainable in terms of social interaction and social life, and most importantly, from my perspective, sustainable in terms of community. And we want measures that can tackle homelessness and the housing crises that are affecting our communities. I think within this very insightful report, we have a lot of recommendations that can put us on a pathway to deliver on these related goals if we take it seriously by targeting urban renewal. I'd agree with Deputy Gould, however, that any report is only as good as its implementation. I've heard no voice pulling against this report here in the Chamber this evening. So let's drive on. There are excellent recommendations here. Let's put them in place, and let's make sure that this is not a report that sits on a shelf gathering dust.